we've got Jonas Lamas from Staker DAO, James War from Metacartel. Great names at Metacartel. Peter Pan, James War. It is a fantastic group. Priyanka Desai from Open Law, and Lasse Clausen from 1KX is going to moderate to talk about the economy of DAOs. They are emerging. They are going to be big. And these are a few of the folks at the forefront of the emerging DAO economy. Lasse, take it away.
Thank you. Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for tuning in. I think DAOs and governments were a very hot topic to the point that they were it's getting annoying, to be honest. A lot of Twitter back and forth about governance. I remember people seeing, whenever you show the words that you've muted on Twitter, I think governance was high on the list for a while. But it's still really one of the most interesting and probably most complex aspects of blockchains, especially because it is essentially a human sort of process, organizational, social beast, I would call it, right? So code in a way can be very easy and clean and predictable, and humans cannot. So I think DAOs are probably among the most complex topic that blockchains are facing. But to start off, if you could please introduce yourself, share a little bit with us, what are you working on, and how maybe you have experience or how you're involved with DAOs. Priyanka, if you want to start.
Yeah, hey everyone, thanks for having me. So I'm Priyanka Desai, I'm with Open Law. We recently launched a project called the LAO at the end of April. This project is a for-profit venture DAO. So the idea here is members, accredited investors can come together, pool their Ethereum and invest in different projects for either equity or tokens, and specifically in the Ethereum ecosystem. So yeah, things are really moving well. I'm excited to talk about it, and great to see some friendly faces here. I love my DAO.
Hey guys, headphones pulling up. My name's James War. I'm based in New Zealand. I'm the founder of Axia Labs and a pretty core contributor of a lot of the DAO efforts, involved in a lot of the Metacartel stuff and sort of the grant giving side, and then also Metacartel Ventures, and which is a similar sort of concept to the DAO, sort of an open investment framework for the wider world to sort of invest into projects similar to the DAO in 2016, but revamped in a slightly different way. Yeah. Excited for the panel.
Cool. Hey,
Jonas?
everybody. Yep, thanks. I'm Jonas Lamas, and I am the founder of a DAO called Staker DAO. And Staker DAO is actually running a decentralized financial application set on Tezos. And so we have a really cool mechanism for governing decision making there from our community, and we're starting to launch DeFi products, if you will. And the first one is actually an ERC20 token, which maybe we'll talk about a bit later.
Okay, who wants to go first? Who wants to take a stab at explaining, what is a DAO? What actually is it? And still we're all like, maybe 5-year-olds. Like, how do you explain what a DAO actually is? Who's gonna go?
I'm happy to start. I mean, I think, a DAO is really just programmable money. And the basic use case of programmable money, I think, in 2016, as the Ethereum community, we discovered that, we sort of found the DAO as one of the really first big things to sort of gather around and get excited about. And obviously, that experiment broke, and that makes sense. But, 4 years later, it feels like we're sort of dipping our toes or maybe jumping head first straight back in. And that's really exciting. And I think, what a DAO is just the best application of programmable money. We can make decentralized applications and smart contracts, do backflips in whatever direction we want. But actually building them around humans and around people, I think, is sort of what DAOs are and why they're most interesting.
Do you think, does a DAO have to be money oriented though? I was thinking that, in the case of Tezos, which is the rabbit hole that I've gone down myself for the last couple of years, I feel like we have a DAO, a layer one DAO, even though we don't really call it a DAO, but we have this decentralized governance model in place where like the token holders are making the decisions about how the thing moves forward. And there's no central organization that has ultimate authority or control over it. And I kind of feel like by putting the decision making and the governance process and the evolution of the governance process in the hands of the token holders, you're sort of taking the things out of the world of the corporation, and you're putting it into this new kind of construct that we're calling a DAO.
Yeah, I would actually piggyback off that. I think DAOs are interesting because I think it's a great way to group together individuals on the internet for decision making. That can be for voting on things that are not financially focused. So, I mean, of course, we tend to think about DAOs in the context of pooling capital and in the financial context, but it also could be great for governance and exploring things outside of that. Just also to echo a little bit about what James said at the Lao, you know, we also kind of take the learnings from what we saw in the 2016 DAO. I think that was a pretty amazing experiment. Of course, it ran afoul to the hack and some securities issues, and that's I think at this point, years later, that like DAO hangover is over. The technology has improved within years, and I think people really do see DAOs as a blockchain killer app. This is something that's, I think, really novel to blockchain and an amazing use case that I think the world, especially the crypto ecosystem, is ready for.
Yeah, so you know, I run a fund called 1KX, but I'm also a member of the Arweave community DAO and also the Mainnet Venture DAO. And to me, essentially, I mean, a DAO really is just moving the you know, the legal expense and complication that you usually have in the real world with attorneys, etc., and formalizing and notarizing sort of decision among groups. You're just basically moving that on chain and therefore sort of establishing in a similar way that, okay, this vote has been enacted, let's not go back and re-talk about this thing the whole time, right? So this is kind of my my definition of it. In my experience, also, you still, it's just a notary stamp at the end of a pretty long funnel. And if someone has some, you know, can share some real world experiences, what it actually takes, like what are all the things that happen before, you know, you have, you know, you see the transaction on the Ethos scan that, you know, something was confirmed.
Yeah, and it's a notary stamp that is not issued by the federal government, right, through some federal process. It's a notary stamp that is agreed to by the community that wants to stamp stuff, essentially, right? You know, like before the Industrial Revolution, we all lived in villages and tribes, and we all had our own notary stamps in those communities, right? There was some process of decision making and some process of governance and evaluating whether or not the, you know, the actions of the group were being, you know, were in context of how things are supposed to be governed or in violation. And the notary stamp at the end of the day was the decision making process of how to deal with that. And we've gotten away from the tribal notary stamp to the federal processes and the, you know, institutional processes we have. But I think a DAO gives us an opportunity to swing back towards the village making its own decisions about how things should run.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I can share some experience from what we found with the Lao. So as I mentioned, we launched at the end of April. We have about 2 projects right now that have been proposed for vote. One of them looks like it's going through Tornado Cash. So that'll be our first investment, which is very exciting, very cool project. Just to kind of rewind though, what happened before that actually hit the proposal process is, and this is all becoming a little ad hoc, and it really, I think, varies DAO to DAO and what the risk appetite and what the kind of internal operations that your members want in that DAO. But what we found with ours specifically is, you know, initially a proposal comes, we share all that information, those learnings, and this is all off chain, by the way. So this is pre-proposal. So we have weekly member calls where generally the members share their opinions. This also gets carried over to, you know, online towards a Discord chat. We have internal off-chain polls on just gauging interest on whether people want to proceed at different stages. You have a due diligence call with the founders, pool questions from the members, because obviously everyone's all over the world and different time zones make it difficult. Record the call. They then review that, and then we'll have one last vote just to see whether or not it should be proposed. And you know, more often than not, there's some broad consensus. But for example, there's some projects out there that are kind of on the fence. You see, folks either yes or no, and in that case, you also might as well just propose it. So it's not necessarily you get a broad consensus that everyone will say yes. I think sometimes it's just easier to post it and get people to vote and make a decision, because at a certain point you could kind of fall in this endless loop of discussing the merits of a project. So at a certain point you just gotta stick it up and put it to vote. And I think we're gonna see some no's. So it's not like everything on chain is gonna get funded or anything proposed is gonna get funded. So I think it's been interesting to see that kind of process emerge too.
Yeah, and I mean, just to echo that as well, I mean, that's certainly how basically every decision inside of Metacartel and Metacartel Ventures even have been made. It is this like pre-chain process that actually matters a lot more than anything that's sort of happening on chain. And whether that's the humans jumping on a call every week, or sort of a Discord bot sort of making a summary of all the events of that week, it is like those soft processes, and I think that's sort of the difference between some of these sort of more open DAOs and some of these more closed DAOs, right? So something like we were talking before about Tezos or sort of Maker, and that sort of fully open model where it has to be a lot more on chain because that discussion is sort of happening in a lot less of a permissioned way, versus something like these DAOs like the DAO or Metacartel Ventures, where it's done in such a permissioned way in the first place to get involved in it, that actually that process can be a lot more hands-on and human.
Any more experiences like the realities of running DAOs? I have a few thoughts, but I want to give you give you guys the stage first.
I'll comment a little bit about what we've learned in the past few months of running Staker DAO on Tezos. The DAO itself went live on January 1st, and we opted for a governance model that is again similar to the Tezos model, where in Tezos you have token holders who delegate their staking rights. That's proof of stake network. Obviously, they delegate their staking rights to the bakers, and the bakers ultimately also get the voting rights along with those delegation rights. And so the voters vote for the proposals that flow through the system. And that process, since it launched over the last couple of years, has had a really high rate of voter participation. It's been 70 to 80 to 90% participation by coin holdings on the decision-making processes that have flowed through Tezos. And so we liked that model a lot. And so we basically copied a lot of that for what we were doing with Staker DAO, which means we have kind of a representative model as well. So we put this in place so that the token holders would elect a council on an annual basis, and then the council, which currently is 5 members, is the voting body, and it represents the token holders, but it gets the final say on each of the proposals that flows through our system. It's interesting in the sense that we get a high participation rate because the council knows that they're representing people and they need to be paying attention. On the flip side of that, you get probably less robust participation at the token holder level than you do in a one coin holder, one vote type of model. Our token holders are actively engaged in the discussion, just like yours are off chain, about what should we be building and how should it change, and participating in polls and whatnot. But at the end of the day, we don't need all of them to come to the table to vote for everything. And so that's been an interesting model. So far has worked. We've had 5 proposals flow through our system, and we've had most of our 5 council members vote on all of them.
I think you touched on an interesting contentious issue is, okay, maybe by market cap or by money, you have a high participation rate. But how does that compare to the actual individual sort of addresses or supposed individual token holders? Is it because there's coin holder voting is kind of like the new plutocracy, right? You have a few large funds, a few whales. At the end you have 5 people deciding 98% of the value. Do you have any experience with that or any numbers on that?
Well, I think the incentive mechanism in something like proof of stake or delegated proof of stake in this particular case is that if I, as a token holder, and it doesn't matter if I'm holding one Tez or a million Tez, if I don't participate in the validation process by either running my own node and running my own validator or delegating my validation rights to someone else who's running that node or validator, then I'm not then I'm missing out on the inflation funding that everyone else is receiving, right? Because you have to stake your tokens in order to get the nodes to run, to create blocks, and by creating blocks, you're receiving rewards for doing so, as well as transaction fees and whatnot. And so I think that if you look at the latest data on Tezos, there's I think it's about an 80% token holder participation, or 80% of all of the tokens in circulation are staked with some validator. I myself, before I launched StakerDAO, ran one of the larger validators on Tezos called Tezos Capital, and we have over 1,500 individual wallets that are staking with us, and most of them are less than 10 Tez. They're very small amounts, but then we have some that have hundreds of thousands of Tez in them. So we're seeing, I think my validator is probably a pretty good example of the distribution of staking. But what I'm seeing is new people coming to the ecosystem are coming there partially because this notion of participation. It's not just to hold the coin, but it's to participate in the staking operation so that you can be part of the decision-making process.
And I guess sort of a question around that is that participating, right? Like, are these people sort of that are buying the token and holding it to stake it to get more tokens? Like, are these people actually participating, or are these people just sort of collecting free upside over time?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of it is the latter, as you're saying, though, in the sense that, there's 490, 500 bakers. These are the node operators in the Tezos ecosystem that are either staking their own tokens. I think of the 500 people who are producing blocks in the Tezos ecosystem, about 200 of them are collecting delegation rights from other people, like the node that I ran, right? And so it means 300 people are interested enough in this to run their own node, stake their own tokens, make their own decisions, vote, and participate. The rest of us, the other 200 of us, we're representing the other 30,000 wallet holders, essentially, who are 50,000, I don't know what the number is today, but that have decided that they are not going to run their own nodes. They're instead going to pass that voting right on to somebody else. So,
well, I think we might be converging onto the real world where and Rick Burton, shout out to you for creating this concept of a protocol politician, because what we're seeing is that there are a lot of sort of trivial votes in a protocol as well. It's not always super exciting life or death decisions here. And then usually the participation rate just really, really drops and gets very low. And this is kind of where, this is why the rest of the world sort of invented this concept that here's someone who's, who might be doing this full time, and maybe there's a way to incentivize that person to even deal with basically all the boring issues that we don't want to deal with, right? This is literally what happens in the real world. I don't care about tax law, let someone else figure it out. And so I'm curious if that, if you see that taking off. It hasn't. I guess Compound sort of was the first one to start this sort of concept. There's a list, gets a bit of a ranking, right? It's kind of like, okay, who's in there and who gets the most sort of delegations.
Yeah, so at least for WoW, OpenLaw serves, we've built the DApp and everything, but we serve as a software administrator. We're not a member, but we're more just kind of managing and doing the internal operations, like sending the annual K1s and kind of the nitty-gritty, boring stuff required for managing an organization we kind of handle, as well as kind of shepherding, kind of back to this like idea of voter participation, voter apathy that I think a lot of people highlight. We kind of shepherd that along as well. But I guess just to quickly, jump back to that, or kind of on the same line, I think, what's really important for that is just, what we built is this idea of delegated voting. So I'm not sure you might need to have like a politician or some sort of administrator handling that, but I think the notion of having these busy folks or these folks that in this member managed DAO to delegate their address and their vote to a third party, I think maybe takes that weight off a bit, and that's what we built on the DAO. And so far, no member has chosen to delegate their votes, but we're eventually as things sort of progress, I would imagine that that happens. And so yeah, I think that there's ways around incentivizing people to vote as well.
I I think there's another very large issue for these sort of public DAOs, right? The Lao and Metacartel is more like a permission DAO where you have sort of a screening process, but these public DAOs where you have pure coin holder vote, I think it's a huge problem. I think we've seen it with Aragon. You basically borrow a lot of ants, you vote, and you offload them again, right? With Compound, you're starting to have pretty good lending markets for that. I think Curve is experimenting sort of with a governance that is based on the period of time that you hold the token, or actually the period of time that you stake them sort of into the protocol. I think there's also, I wouldn't discard coin holder voting yet. I think there's very clever mechanisms that you can sort of assure that the people that are actually the most aligned on the long term with the protocol actually get to make those decisions. And I think the first versions of DAOs, I would say MakerDAO is probably the most successful one, haven't been able to add that refinement yet. I think recently they added the delegation, which I think is a great first step because you can delegate also towards more active full-time professionals. But I think overall it's just something very, very powerful when people get to have a say or have the sense, even in Ethos where it's very lightweight, I get to choose who do I delegate to, right? And if that validator doesn't represent, or Baker doesn't represent my opinion, I can still always undelegate and choose someone else, right? So I think it's really powerful for people to have the sense that it's not a dead end and you're completely helpless, but you can actually sort of participate.
Yeah, I agree. And going back to your point about the sort of coin voting versus those other parameters that can be added on over time, I think that really is the solution for a lot of these sort of more open DAOs, right? Sort of like the makers of the world, is this multi-weighted governance, right? Sort of, and there's, compounding, curve balancer, whatever, are doing different experiments in the space. But I think it is that idea of like, it's not just the number of tokens you have, right? It's how long you've held them, it's how many proposals you've submitted, how many, proposals you've vetted or done due diligence on. And I think that is actually the important piece for basically all of these more open DAOs, right? What are those other parameters? What are the other multipliers we're throwing on the end to sort of add that governance pie up? So it's not just, I have lots of tokens, I decide what happens.
Yeah. More specific, what about high gas fees? Is that going to kill the whole thing? I mean, we've seen, I've said on some votes where I know, like, I think this looks like it's going to pass. It's not important. How are we going to deal with that? We don't know, right?
As long as the DAOs keep managing more and more capital, it's fine.
Yeah.
It can just be a percentage.
Problem, right?
Come to Tezos. We have low gas fees.
Interesting. Another challenge. If you have any experience with, like, who's running this thing? If it's sort of just a collection of individuals that are feeling pretty good about doing a little bit of it, it tends to be pretty chaotic. Do you have any experience with like what kind of models work well, or?
I'm sure Pri has some ideas on how the LAO has worked. I'll just share quickly on Staker. I think the grander your vision, probably the more regulatory muck you're going to have to deal with. And in our case, we have a pretty grand vision with Staker DAO, which is that, we want to create a community of investors who are making decisions about launching many different financial products over time. The first of which is a ETF type product that represents a basket of proof of stake tokens called Blend, which is going to be an ERC20 token. And so when you start to talk about all these different permutations of chains and financial products and things that sound like they're in the realm of a securities, you have to start working about what is the underlying what is the underlying governance structure related to the real world? How do you build something that can endure, the real world law in addition to the on-chain law that you want to create? And so in our case, we went pretty far off the deep end and actually created our DAO through a Cayman corporation, and the token holders who are the community of our DAO are actually holding equity in the corporation. And so we've tokenized their equity on Tezos, but that by doing so right now, that means it's not a utility token. It's not something that anybody can just trade around and anybody can buy and sell it as much as they want. It's like you're buying an investment in a private startup, essentially, when you hold that token, and all the rights and responsibilities essentially of holding equity go along with that. I think what's really interesting is how that will change over time. Will we be able to sufficiently decentralize our DAO to the point where maybe our security token can become a utility? I don't know. There are certainly other projects like Compound and UMA and others who are trying to push that as quickly as possible. But I think that's one of the major interesting paths for that the DAOs are going to have to go down. Some of us going from security to utility, maybe some of them going from utility to security. And then what is the whole regulatory environment going to do over time to make us go one way or the other?
And so going back to sort of circling back to the idea of how do we incentivize sort of people to, actually participate in these DAOs, I think a lot of it is just about the size of them. I think realistically when you're managing, 500K versus 500 mil, there's a different level of commitment that goes along with that and sort of time and energy that needs to go into it. And a lot of these DAOs are sort of so small that they sort of can be pushed forward by these community-led efforts. But I think, for example, of the Lao and Metacartel Ventures, I think as you sort of scale up and you basically become this, investment DAO group, there is a level of work that's needed per day or per whatever week to get it all happening. And I think, I'm interested in how the Lao's been dealing with this, but certainly inside of Metacartel Ventures, there's just a paid operations role, and just standard like any other company, there's someone doing operations and they're solving a lot of problems for the DAO and communicating that information to the DAO. And that's certainly how I think a lot of these problems get solved.
Yeah, I think that the size definitely here makes a difference. So, given with the Lao, for legal reasons, we can't have more than 100 members. And so really it becomes a little bit more manageable at that point. So as I mentioned, OpenLaw is the software administrator. We kind of just make sure all the internal operations, are smooth. I will say, so the general ethos and thesis of the Lao, we've kept it very high level, but the idea really is to create this notion of a permissionless Silicon Valley, really support the Web3 community, really make it all crypto native to begin with. Everyone on, as far as the participants of Lao are very interested in this idea of governance tokens. They love the idea of being token holders. So I think when you have a membership that is crypto native, knows it well, wants to see this notion of a decentralized venture capital fund, not where founders have to spend, whatever 60% of their time chasing VCs and pitching and going to Silicon Valley, knocking on the doors of Sandhill shops. I think that has, allowed this ability of folks self-selecting to see this model really come to light and fruition. So because of that, we really had this community of people who want to see it work. They want, and actually alternatively, I will say there's a lot of projects that, want Lao/DAO investment because they want it all to be Web3 native. They also feel the same way. So you have this really great group of both projects and members that self-select into this. And because they believe in this strongly, I think you're seeing a lot of participation. It doesn't really take a tremendous amount of work from our, from my end or OpenLaw's end to really wrangle the troops, if you will, or get people involved. People show up, they're excited. They bring in projects that they like and have talked to. And we have such a wide array of, folks that are founders of protocols you've definitely heard of, foundation people, early ETH folks. So again, it's almost like a nice network for them as well. And I think just to echo James, that, having a size where the members themselves can also get to know each other is great for them too. So it's beyond, so from my end, it hasn't felt like a tremendous amount of effort to really get them involved in voting. Some people want to be anonymous or silent. We respect that and don't mind it. And they might just participate on the voting stuff, but that's okay. And we welcome that. So of the close to 30 people that are members of the Lao, I think we're seeing really, really active participation from at least 13 or 14, which is great. Yeah.
So if we sort of, summarize a DAO as, sort of a hard-coded rules and permissionless access to determine the fate of a public good. Let's take aside the permissioned DAOs and sort of say, big public ones are, everybody gets to participate if they, do something, but it's open for everyone. It's also the rules can't just be changed sort of in the back by, in the back room by a small number of people. And so with those, we sort of seen kind of like, I would say probably the biggest one is Maker, right? So it's like a central bank where you can create your stable coin. We've got Compound for lending, UMAs for trading positions. Where do you, right? So it's all kind of like somewhat niche still, very sort of DeFi oriented. And if you sort of project out for 10 years, what do you think, where could you see DAOs under that sort of framework? What do you think would make sense?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I think a good one. I mean, I would like to see, I think it makes sense that it's starting out pretty heavily in like these DeFi protocols. That seems logical, and there seems to be like a clear product market fit there, especially as they're trying to increasingly decentralize, which I think is good for the members as well and people participating on the protocols. I think it'll be kind of interesting to see when we can meld together both Web 2 and Web 3 worlds. I think what Web 2 does really well is it share information and create communities online. So that can be either like Twitter, Reddit, whatever. And I think it'd be kind of interesting to, and we've seen Reddit now experiment with tokens, that the next phase of that really kind of put together like subreddit DAOs or something of that nature, where folks of a certain subreddit that are passionate about, you know, let's say it's like the COVID-19 subreddit, they can pull together and make decisions like purchase masks for donation or something of that nature. I think that seeing that work in more normalized environments in like 10 years would not be surprising at all to me. And I think it's kind of the natural progression of Web 2 to Web 3. So yeah, I think that would be very cool.
Yeah, I agree. Bricks and Moons, the Reddit tokens need DAOs, and we've already had conversations about that and sort of working out how do we reach out to those communities and sort of make that happen. Because I think that, totally agree, that is sort of the next step. You know, starting with this like deep down the DeFi protocol rabbit hole, you know, and governing that, or sort of, you know, super down an investment rabbit hole and governing that. You know, both super interesting experiments that we should do, but actually sort of the opening up of the DAO programmable money world to wider, you know, Web 2 people, general internet folks, I think is really interesting, and that's definitely what we're going to see.
Yeah, and not only that, like speaking of, you know, the prior conversation, they actually have like moderators too. So if you need people to shepherd things along, I mean, you already have that natural setup of like moderated groups.
And I think and totally, whether it's like the Reddit DAOs or anything else, there's like these product DAOs, so the likes of Meta Factory, Our Zora, you know, these types of things. I think these are going to be a really good step into the Web 2 world as well, where it's like, you know, here's a hoodie, and you buy a hoodie and you also get a game item, and you buy a hoodie and you get a game item, and you also get DAO shares, and sort of now you own part of that brand. And I think, you know, that bridge through physical products, you know, stuff like that, as well as the sort of Reddit Web 2 stuff, is how we sort of open the floodgates to a lot of crypto. I think is through this governance angle.
I mean, I think if you just look at the NFT space right now, it's just starting to become something really interesting. And 10 years from now, you know, I suspect that most of what we want to buy is going to be digital. Because I think many people will be spending much more time in their computers with their AR headsets and their VR and, you know, their 3D worlds. And if you look at, you know, Sandbox or Crypto Voxels or, you know, Decentraland right now, those are really early, obviously, but the power of allowing communities to build their worlds online is going to be really compelling over the coming decades. And those communities need DAOs, right? I would love to see Decentraland DAOify itself, so that, you know, there's some way that the landholders or the participants or the, you know, the people who are creating the cool artwork can have more of a control over how the world evolves, rather than just having Ben build new islands out there and sell more apartments associated with them. So, you know, I think there's a real opportunity here for everything to get DAOified in time.
Yeah, and I actually think Decentraland is thinking about that too. I actually just wanted to add one point to what James was saying. I think we'll see a lot of protocols, I think for sure, go in this direction of a DAO, and we already are seeing that. I will just add, I think what I think is interesting and what we're thinking about internally, well, one is that this idea of having like protocol adjacent DAO. So you can imagine a protocol, let's say even Bitcoin, have a, I mean, that's too big, but like you can think of, I don't know, another protocol where the folks can pull together those tokens, the community can pull together those tokens and actually start investing in projects that are building on top of that protocol. So it could be totally separate from the actual software developers working on that protocol, but it also could leverage their token and actually incentivize the community to build on it.
Ethos.
Yeah, the ability to do that. So I think that we'll see a little bit like protocol adjacent type DAOs emerge as well. So
yeah, interestingly on that as well, I think like one of the really interesting things we're seeing at the moment in the token space is basically like and I wrote something a while ago saying there'll be more DAOs than tokens, right? Every token ends up either becoming a DAO or having its own DAO, but naturally. And I think this is sort of what we're going to see over the progression as we started in this utility. Oh, a token gives you discounts if you hold it for 3 months and blah, 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 blah. But actually, probably more likely that token should actually have some role in how the thing is working, right? And how the things, whether that's product features, whether that's, fee distribution, whatever that ends up being. And I think actually the majority of these tokens over time end up using some DAO model for either distribution of their tokens or fees or governance of the product, etc. And that's sort of exciting to follow as well in the token world.
For me personally, the last week, what became extremely urgent is actually something like Twitter needs to be a public good. It needs to be run like a DAO, right? Who gets to decide whether that was hate speech and inciting violence or it wasn't, right? And quite frankly, Twitter as a private company is completely out of their element to decide, yes, we need to add some, some statements here or not. And I think also the Facebook approach, yeah, whatever, we're not gonna, we let everything run, I think is also a problem. So,
sorry, go ahead.
Right, so I do think actually the last week kind of like really pushed forward in much further into the mainstream. Actually, this concept of DAOs and sort of public goods than we anticipated. Now. I think with that we're coming to the end. Thank you everyone for joining. Hope this was insightful. And you can unmute governance and DAOs now.
Thanks everybody so much.